if you happen to hear Trent loose yesterday, I've got a little bit of the same message in that we need the grassroots effort to get some messages out to the people, and you are the people to do that. The NPPC is a great organization. They're a great lobby presence for you in D.C. They do great work with research. They can fund a lot of projects, but when it comes down to talking to local people, they trust you and they know you. And when the conversation of the use of antibiotics in animals comes up at the coffee shop or the local bar or wherever, I want to arm you with a couple bits of information that you can use to try to spread accurate truth and facts as opposed to a lot of the innuendo that's out there and a lot of the misinformation that's spread in an attempt to curb the use of antibiotics in animals raised for food. I'm not saying there's no problem. I try to bring a voice of reason to the conversation to say the people that say we're all going to die because we use antibiotics in animals are wrong, and the people that say there's absolutely no issue at all, they're wrong. What you need to do is engage the conversation at the level of understanding of the person you're visiting with. There is a true concern about the increasing number of bacteria that are becoming resistant to an increasing number of antibiotics, which makes it very difficult for the healthcare profession to treat some infections. We have some infections that are 50% fatal today because they're resistant to all antibiotics. That's just not acceptable. That particular one I'm mentioning has never been linked to animal use of antibiotics, however. That's where the conversation needs to go. What resistance is linked to the use of antibiotics in animals raised for food? And that's what I'll try to clarify today. We'll have a little time for questions and answers, hopefully answers, questions for sure, at the end. Before I get started, I need to make a little open, transparent statement here that I do have a consulting relationship with Elanco and with Merck, two of the producers of animal antibiotics. However, my work with them is more related to beta agonists and recombinant bovine somatotropin in an attempt to get those technologies on an international basis to help better feed the world through the use of safe technology. My talk today has not been underwritten or approved by either one of those two companies. Fact is, they wouldn't approve it, and you'll see that as we get into the talk. But they know I'm here, and I do work with them trying to help them with their messaging, because I think 2 years ago they were very wrong in the way they had their messaging going, and they need to listen to the people and listen to their concerns and address those concerns, and I think they're doing a better job of it now. I also, and I hesitate to bring this up to the Iowa Pork Producers Association, but I also serve on Tyson's Animal Wellbeing Advisory Panel, the company that sent the letter out a week or two ago saying you may need to consider the way changes in the way you raise little pigs and sows. I had nothing to do with that letter, however, I will point that out. My goal today is to give you 3 or 4 very important points to keep in mind when you have these discussions, and I hope you will have these discussions on a more of a local basis. I want to give you numbers that are facts, that are true, can't be misinterpreted, but it can shoot down the rhetoric that says 80% of all antibiotics used in this country are used in perfectly healthy animals. We need to stop that part of the conversation. I want to talk to you a little bit about how antibiotic resistance actually occurs, because you're going to hear a lot of myths about that also that are just plain inaccurate and not true. I want to define a superbug. That's pretty easy to do, but with the recent Foster Farms related outbreak on the western coast, actually it involved 23 states, 400 people were sickened with multi-drug resistant salmonella. The people that don't want us to slaughter animals for food were saying these superbugs are going to kill us all. We need to make these adulterants, which would actually shut down the poultry industry. So they were not superbugs. They were multi-drug resistant, but I'll explain the difference between multi-drug resistant and superbugs. Trent, I already acknowledged your talk yesterday, so I'm not going to go back and do that again. But I told him I want the grassroots message, same as you do. By the way, if you were in Trent's talk yesterday, he referenced there was one person in the audience who went to high school with his father-in-law. That was me, but I was actually in 6th grade when Eldon was a high school senior running through defenses on the football field, and he was my idol. So that's my relationship with Trent. Then I want to talk a little bit about methicillin-resistant Staph aureus, commonly called MRSA. The last year or two, there have been many, many studies reported from institutions like Johns Hopkins, the Pew Charitable Trust, Consumer Reports, about how animals are carrying MRSA, and we're all going to die because of that, even though there's not been one case of livestock-associated MRSA ever reported in the United States of America. It is not a factor in this conversation. I want to give you the information so you can use that. And then lastly, is there a link to antibiotic use in animals and antibiotic resistance being a threat to our health? That's not clear. I'll tell you right now, you're not going to walk out of here with a clear-cut answer to that question. That's because nobody has the answer. But I want to give you some things to use in that conversation. Now, perception versus reality. This country thinks we're doing a very poor job in producing safe meat and poultry for consumption. That's because the media is giving them the indication that we're doing worse than we were 10 years ago. In the last 10 years, the actual documented instances of foodborne illnesses in this country have declined by 29%. But yet the media hits regarding outbreaks is up 150%, and the media hits regarding recalls is up 250%. So people are reading about recalls all the time. That Foster Farms outbreak, every day there was an update. 3 more people found ill, 13 more people found ill, 1 more state. You just couldn't get it off of the news media. The difference between now and at the turn of the century is something called PulseNet. It's a CDC-invented method of fingerprinting bacteria. So if a person in Illinois has a foodborne illness with salmonella and a person in Iowa has a foodborne illness with salmonella, the CDC takes those 2 samples, takes a look at them and says, these are exactly the same DNA fingerprint. They had to come from the same source. Now, the more people you have that you can interview about what they ate in the last 3 days before they got sick, the better chance you have of coming up with a common factor. That Foster Farms outbreak would not have made the media 20 years ago because they would not have been linked together, probably. But now we are so good at finding the source that it makes a headline. I mean, if we just said 400 people have salmonella in the western states, that's not a headline. But when we say Foster Farms is the bad guy, Wright Egg Farms in Iowa is the bad guy, Peanut Corporation of America is the bad guy. When you can finger a corporation that's making money selling food, you suddenly have a bad guy. And that gets people inflamed. So the perception is we're worse. The fact is we're a whole lot better, not only at producing safer food, but finding the source. And the more times we can find the source, the better chance we have of finding a way to prevent that from ever happening again. We're getting better. That's a fact. You need to remember that. Now, a lot of consumers out there, and Trent really talked a lot about this yesterday, view factory farming, big ag, whatever, as bad for us. They view technology as bad, when in fact technology will help feed the world. But technology isn't just beta agonists and antibiotics, which most of you in this room use in one form or another in your daily practices of raising hogs. Technology includes feed, transportation, controlled climate. It includes a lot of things that are very good and actually are very good for the animals themselves. Okay, we have to have a basic definition to have this conversation of what an antibiotic is. An antibiotic is antimicrobials that are actually produced by a microorganism, a living organism, like a fungus, like Penicillium produces penicillin. It's produced by a living organism and inhibits the growth of other microorganisms. Now, in that definition is included something called the ionophores. Ionophores are not used in human medicine at all. They would make you very sick if you ever took one. But they are used a great deal in our flocks to prevent coccidiosis from going through a grow-out facility of 30,000 chicks. Ionophores make up 30% of all the antibiotics used in animal industry. I don't care if a coccidiosis gets resistant to an ionophore because I'm never going to take it, never going to prescribe it. Remember that. It's not just penicillin. It is other antimicrobials produced by a living organism to kill another living organism, and it doesn't have to be bacteria. It can be a parasite like coccidiosis. Important to understand. Now, by strictest of the definition, this is really splitting hairs, so I won't spend any time on this, but by strictest definition, what we call antibiotics, only 75% are made by a living organism. The other 25% are synthetically built, produced antibiotics by industry. Technically, they are not an antibiotic, but when you get into this conversation, the people against using antibiotics in animals lump them all together. So for today, I'm lumping them all together. Even the third generation penicillins and cephalosporins that are not produced by a living microorganism, I'm going to call antibiotics today. Now, Congresswoman Slaughter, the Pew Charitable Trust, Consumer Union, Johns Hopkins, Bloomberg School of Public Health, multiple large organizations that are very well financed, keep making the same statement that 80% of all antibiotics sold in the United States are used in perfectly healthy animals. So I have to use the antibiotic definition that they use to counter what they say. Now, as an aside, we don't talk about how many hogs we slaughtered today or how many chickens will be slaughtered tomorrow. We talk about harvesting. We harvested 30,000 chickens at this plant. So I think Congresswoman Slaughter, I will refer to as Congresswoman Harvest for the rest of the day, just to be politically correct. Now, antibiotic resistance. How does that develop? Well, sometimes it's just spontaneous. Sometimes it's because of exposure to an antibiotic. Sometimes it's passage of a plasmid or a DNA particle from one organism to another organism, not even related to being exposed to the antibiotic. But why do some organisms like staph become resistant within a year of a new medicine being invented, whereas some like strep still respond to plain old-fashioned penicillin 60 years after it was first produced? Why is that? Our top scientists do not know. And if you think, this is a quote from Guy Lonergan, who's on the faculty at Texas Tech and a good friend of mine, if you think you understand how microbes develop resistance to antibiotics, then it hasn't been properly explained to you. And I agree with that. I don't know why they do. We hear a lot about low-dose antibiotics, subtherapeutic dose antibiotics used in the animal industry. Subtherapeutic is a term that should never be used. The doses you use for your hogs, depending on their age and the weather and other things, are therapeutic as approved by the FDA for a specific purpose at a specific time. Now, low dose means there's something in the herd, or there's something in the neighboring herd, or there's something associated with weaning that you know produces an increased risk of an infection going through your herd or your flock. And so you give them a low-dose antibiotic for a very short period of time. You don't give them a dose that's therapeutic to treat a pneumonia. You give them a dose that's therapeutic to prevent the pneumonia. But the naysayers will say it's those low-dose antibiotics that let the germs develop a resistance because you're not giving them a full dose. That just is not true. The question that I have, and I do not know the answer to this either, is it better to treat 10,000 hogs with a low-dose antibiotic to prevent infection going through the herd, or is it better to let 1,000 of those hogs get very sick and then use a high-dose antibiotic for a long period of time? Which one has a better chance of developing resistance? I don't know. But I know which one produces a healthier animal at less cost so I can afford to eat pork chops. And it's also an issue of animal well-being. Why would we intentionally let our herds or flocks become very sick if we knew we could prevent it with a low-dose antibiotic? Now, the Danes 12 years ago started an experiment. Because of social pressure, they said we're using too many antibiotics, so the pig farmers could no longer use low-dose antibiotics as growth promotion, as feed enhancement. Sounded really good until you look at what happened in reality. This purple, that's the amount of antibiotics they were using for growth promotion. The yellow is the amount of antibiotics prescribed for humans. The blue was the amount of antibiotics prescribed by doctors of veterinary medicine to treat actual diseases in the herd. When they stopped using these as growth promoters, this is what happened to the use of antibiotics prescribed by veterinarians. It is now, the total here is now greater than the total here, by far. So they're using more antibiotics in Denmark in their animals now than they were 12 years ago when they banned the use of growth promotion because they have more infection. So they're using higher doses for a longer period of time to treat an infection. And again, I don't know whether that is a greater risk for antibiotic resistance or is low dose. But this is a fact. And this is what you're all going to be facing after Guidance 213 goes into effect. You're going to have to figure out ways to keep this from happening in America. The Danes tell me now they have reversed this trend. They say you need to get a new graph. You need to look at 2011, 2012, and you'll see that number going down because we've gotten better at preventing infections. And I believe them. I just haven't got the data yet. Okay, we've talked about subtherapeutic dosing, and the FDA and the AVMA both say this is an inappropriate use. This is a bad term. Don't use it. It's intended to put modern animal agriculture practices in a bad light. If you're a crunchy mama out there and you got two little kids and the doctor says, I'm sorry, the antibiotic didn't work for the ear infection, there's resistance because the animal industry is using subtherapeutic doses, that ticks her off. And she becomes agitated and she gets on Facebook. Subtherapeutic is not a word we should ever use. Okay, FDA has approved the uses of antibiotics in feed animals for 4 purposes. Treatment of disease, prevention of disease, that's when, like at weaning, there's a greater risk of disease. Control of disease, that's when you've got something documented in your herd or your flock that will spread quickly in a CAFO, so you treat the whole herd or the whole flock with a low dose to control the disease. And then lastly, growth promotion, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But that at present is an FDA-approved use of antibiotics in our animals. It's not really that different than humans. But the medical profession doesn't admit this, and most people don't understand this. Obviously, we use antibiotics to treat infections in humans, but we also use it to control and to prevent. If you have a child in college living in a dormitory, and someone in that dormitory comes down with meningitis, every student in that dormitory will be offered a low dose of penicillin for 3 days to prevent spread. If you have surgery to put in an artificial knee or an artificial hip while you're asleep, they're going to give you a large dose of IV antibiotics to try to prevent infection from developing in that prosthetic. If you have a heart valve, you're going to get 6 doses of erythromycin before and after you go to your dentist for your teeth being cleaned to prevent bacteria from being dislodged and landing on that heart valve. That's to prevent disease. We use it daily. Why wouldn't we use it in animals? Now, we don't have anything for growth promotion that's legal in human medicine. What is the FDA's role in all of this? They've really got a lot of criticism lately for not doing anything, when in fact they've done a lot. In 2005, they do an annual, it's called NARMS, National Antibiotic Resistant Monitoring System, which I will talk about in just a little bit, but they use that data to decide if the use of antibiotics in animals is a threat to our health. And in 2005, they noted a very dramatic increase in resistance in Salmonella and Campylobacter in our poultry flocks to a class of drugs called fluoroquinolones. That's the newest class of antibiotics that have been developed in the United States. And they saw that very quickly, these bacteria are becoming resistant to this category, so they banned its use in feed. Fluoroquinolones, it's called Baytril, it's called Cipro. I don't know if you've ever taken any of these, but they're commonly prescribed. They're very important in human medicine. The FDA has banned their use in animals except for very specific purposes, and they make up less than 0.1% of all antibiotics sold for use in animals. The FDA took an action there that kept these antibiotics effective for you and me. As recently as 2012, they banned certain forms of cephalosporins that were used in animals because they saw a rapidly developing resistance. And cephalosporin is another critically important class of antibiotics for you and me, makes up 0.2% of all antibiotics used in animal medicine. The FDA has been doing its job, I believe. They also establish maximum residue limits for antibiotics in meat and poultry. I think this is an important point because a lot of times the conversation is, I don't want antibiotics in my meat. Well, you don't have antibiotics in your meat because of the maximum residue levels and testing done by the FSIS for residue levels and withdrawal periods after an animal has been treated with an antibiotic before it can go to slaughter or before it can produce milk. That we don't have to worry about. Get that that conversation off of the table. Now, the NARMS, I talked about this. They measure antimicrobial resistance in humans, animals, and retail meats. And the most recent report came out in February of last year, and this is the retail meats. They go across the country, and they buy pork, they buy beef, they buy ground turkey, and they buy chicken. and they test it for 4 different bacteria, and if they're positive, then they test the bacteria for antibiotic resistance so they can see what's happening in a trending fashion. This is how they base their decisions to ban those 2 classes of antibiotics in the last 10 years. Now, the NARMS report came out. It did say ampicillin resistance and salmonella is increasing. No surprise there. We use a lot of salmonella in our poultry flocks. And if you use a lot of, we use a lot of ampicillin in our poultry flocks. And if you use a lot of antibiotics, you're going to see resistance develop. That's a no-brainer. Is it an important resistance? No, because no doctor would use ampicillin to treat a salmonella infection in a human being. So it's a headline, and that's what the media reported. They didn't report the rest of the NARMS report. And if you take the time to read the NARMS report, you'll see some pretty good news. Ciprofloxacin, that category of drugs I mentioned that was banned in 2005, the resistance has dropped from 29% to 18% since its use was banned in poultry. Now, resistance doesn't just go away overnight. Obviously, that's been 9 years ago. But it is going in the right direction because of an action the FDA took. That did not make the media. 18% is still too high, but it's going the right direction. There were no isolates in any of the 4 bacteria, in any of the 4 meat products resistant to vancomycin or linezolid, 2 very critical antibiotics in use in human medicine when bugs are resistant to a lot of other antibiotics. These are 2 critical tools in the box. There is no fluoroquinolone resistance in salmonella from any source, and this is the drug of choice for treating adults with salmonellosis. That's a quote from the FDA NARMS report. Did that make the media? No. So the drug of choice for treating salmonella has no resistance in all the samples they took. That's good news, but that would not sell the newspaper or get airtime at 6 o'clock. Macrolide, which is another important category of antibiotics. Some of you may recognize the name Z-Pak. That's a macrolide that doctors use a lot. The resistance is very low in Campylobacter, 0.5% for Campylobacter jejuni, and they are the drug of choice to treat Campylobacter. Therefore, 199 out of 200 cases of Campylobacter jejuni in a human being is going to be responsive to the drug of choice. Good news. MDR, multi-drug resistance, has increased in salmonella, but it remains very low in Campylobacter. That's where, that makes my point that we don't know what causes antibiotic resistance. These 2 bacteria are commonly associated with poultry. And believe me, they're being exposed to the same antibiotics. If you're treating your chickens with tetracycline and kanamycin and streptomycin, the Campylobacter and the salmonella are both exposed to those antibiotics during the lifetime of that broiler. But yet, no multi-drug resistance in Campylobacter, and it is very common in salmonella. Nobody knows why. Okay, multi-drug resistant salmonella. I told you we'd talk about this a little bit. Yes, it's increasing. The report said that. And those that are against the slaughter of animals for food acted very enraged and alarmed and spread all kinds of reports out there saying we're all going to die. The Environmental Working Group particularly produced a very extensive paper saying all the bad things that were in this report. None of the good things were mentioned. In reality, this report shows that for retail chicken and ground turkey, the 4 most common antibiotics that salmonella showed resistance to were tetracycline, streptomycin, sulfazoxazole, and penicillin. None of these drugs would be used by an intelligent healthcare provider that didn't want to get sued to treat an infection caused by salmonella. The drugs of choice were still effective, despite what the Environmental Working Group said. Now, the FDA doesn't usually do this, but they were so upset about the Environmental Working Group trying to alarm people about a non-alarmist instance that they actually filed a report addressing the Environmental Working Group. You just don't see government do that very often. They release their reports, they let the winds blow where they may, but this time they felt the information was so bad from the Environmental Working Group, that, and this is just a few quotes from a 10-page paper. We do not believe the Environmental Working Group considered the important factors. True, they did not. The NARMS data indicates that first-line treatment for all 4 bacteria that we track are still effective. And lastly, we believe the Environmental Working Group is inaccurate and alarmist to define bacterial resistance to 1 or even a few antimicrobials as superbugs if these bacteria are treatable by other commonly used antibiotics. I talked really early on in this about we're going to define superbugs. A superbug is a bacterial infection that is resistant to one or more of the drugs commonly prescribed to treat that infection, making treatment more difficult, hospitalization more frequent, and death more likely. That's a superbug. Multi-drug resistance to tetracycline, kanamycin, gentamicin, streptomycin. That's not a superbug. Congresswoman Harvest's response to this NARMS report was, we are standing on the brink of a public health disaster. Not true. FDA's GFA Guidance 213 announced in December specific direction for drug sponsors on how to make voluntary changes to the status of their products, such as 1, voluntary removal of performance indications and change in marketing status. 2, sponsor can seek new therapeutic indications at current doses, and they must notify of their intent within 90 days of the final publication of Guidance 213. So we're about a month into this process. You got another 60 days before you're going to hear from your pharmaceutical companies. Are they going to drop the use of an antibiotic you may be using today as a feed enhancer, as a growth promoter? Or are they going to change the label to say it's not for growth promotion anymore, it's for prevention of disease because of what we saw in Denmark? We found out in the Denmark experiment that these low doses used for growth promotion were actually preventing diseases, so technically the industry could change the labeling. And I don't know what they're going to do. They tell me they're not going to change the labeling. We'll see. They got 60 days. If they change the labeling, we don't see any change in the use of antibiotics, is my fear. Oh, and by the way, they have 3 years to implement whatever they say they're going to do. So it isn't going to change in March necessarily. You got 2 or 3 years to watch and see where the winds blow. But if nothing changes, if they just say, okay, we're going to use this antibiotic for prevention rather than growth promotion, that will give Congresswoman Slaughter and the others another tool in their basket to say, you see there, FDA tried voluntary, it didn't work, industry wants to make money, now we need to pass a law. And the PAMTA law that she keeps proposing every year would ban the use of antibiotics for growth promotion, control, and prevention. We're going to see a lot of dead animals, a lot of sick animals, and a lot more use of antibiotics overall if a bill like that ever got passed. I don't think it has a chance of getting passed, but there's sure a lot of talk about it. Okay, I'm going to give you some numbers that I think are important to understand in this conversation. The 80% you've heard me say. I don't like that number when it's used for multiple reasons. First of all, it's not in perfectly healthy animals raised for food. It includes our companion animals like horses, dogs, and cats, and it also includes, obviously, animals that are sick, like with endometritis, mastitis, pneumonias, whatever. It's to treat and control and prevent. It's not just perfectly healthy animals. However, I also disagree with the groups that say repeatedly that all antibiotics administered to animals or raised for food are given under direct supervision and direction of a doctor of veterinary medicine. We all know that's not true. But the United States Farmers and Ranchers Association, or Alliance, whichever it is, continually says this. I used to work for them. I used to write op-eds for them, and they always adjusted my op-eds to put that sentence in there, and I always told them you cannot use my op-ed if you're going to put that sentence in there because it's not true. So we need to get to the middle ground. We need to stop the right and the left from making each other look silly. This is the report that comes out now every year, started in 2010. The FDA didn't used to produce a report on the amount of antibiotics used in animals, but they now do. This is the 2011 report. There is a 2012 report out now. It really isn't any different than this one, and I'm not too good at putting together fancy slides, so I just leave this slide in here because it's the same numbers, basically. This is the summary report. This is a bad title, Antimicrobials Sold or Distributed for Use in Food-Producing Animals. Footnote number 2 right here says this also includes companion animals like horses, cats, and dogs. So why do they have this label, which is misleading and gives Congresswoman Slaughter even more ammunition? But this is the report that I'm going to talk about today. These are the numbers. I know you can't see them from there, but these are the numbers. These are hardcore facts from the FDA for all animals. Whoops. Well, I know. Yeah. Wrong direction. This is a link, and one of the reasons I use PowerPoints and Trent doesn't, and I admire his ability to get up there and talk for 55 minutes and make perfect sense, and that way the people pay attention to him rather than trying to see what the next slide shows, but I use a lot of links. Because I want you, if you need support, if you get in a heated debate or an argument and somebody says those aren't the right numbers, you've got this. You can get hold of Tyler here at the Pork Association and say, can we get Dr. Raymond's links? So you're going to see 3 or 4 links today that can be used in an argument. Because this stuff is based on facts. FDA doesn't agree with 80%. I've already told you basically why they don't agree, except for the fact that these are not doses. These are just simply measurements in kilograms. You treat a pneumonia, and this big bad guy over here is going to take a whole lot of kilograms of penicillin compared to this little 6-pound baby. 2 doses of antibiotics for a pneumonia, probably 100 times more here. So the kilograms is not a good number to use, but it's the only number I've got, so I'm going to stick with it for the rest of the day. Ionophores are 30%. I've already told you that. They're not used in human medicine. They're 30% of that 80% number. Forget them. Okay, what does that leave us? That leaves us about 55% of all antibiotics sold in the United States. There's a category called NIR. It's not individually reported. Back on that page that you couldn't read that had all the different antibiotics, there were cephalosporins, there was penicillins, there was sulfa, there was macrolides, there was fluoroquinolones, there was ionophores, and then there was not individually reported, because the FDA does not report the amount of antibiotics sold for an antibiotic that's made by less than 3 companies. It's called proprietary information. I don't know why they don't report it, but it's the law. So you get a category that includes 12% of all antibiotics sold for use in animals, not individually reported. There's only 2 antibiotics in that category used in human medicine. One of them is the fluoroquinolones, which I already told you is less than 0.1% of all antibiotics sold for use in animals. So that 12% can very safely be said that at least 10% are never used in humans of that NIR. It's even higher than that, but just to make things so you can't get caught. So another 10% in the not individually reported category are not used in humans. Now you have 40% of the 80% are not even allowed to be prescribed in human medicine. The next big category, the biggest category in fact, is oxy and chlorotetracycline, which make up almost 42% of all antibiotics used in the animal industry. And understand that in pork, that may be about 65% of all antibiotics that you pork producers use are tetracycline, oxy and chlorotetracycline. They used to be important in human medicine in the 1950s and 60s, and then the macrolides came into existence, and they're a whole lot better. If you want to take tetracycline to treat an illness, you have to take it 4 times a day on 2 hours after a meal, 2 hours before your next meal. It doesn't kill the bacteria, it just slows their growth. Any milk or dairy products makes it inactive in the gut. So you try to figure out how you can take a pill 4 times a day, 2 hours before and 2 hours after a meal. And remember to do that 4 times a day. And if you forget one or get one dose, it's got a little food in there, so it's ineffective, antibiotic resistance develops very, very rapidly. Tetracyclines, almost every bug we know is resistant to tetracyclines. Doctors don't prescribe it anymore in this country. Antibiotic resistance is a global issue. Tetracycline is a drug of choice in some countries because it's so damn cheap, as you know. So it is an issue, but in this country, don't let the people use that as an argument. So if you take 30 plus 10 plus 42, you now have 82% of antibiotics sold for use in the animal industry in this country are either not allowed in human medicine or simply are not used in human medicine, except as a very poor second or third choice. Last time I prescribed a tetracycline was in the 1980s. And I know that because I left O'Neill, Nebraska in 1990, and my patient had to drive to Grand Island, Nebraska, which is 110 miles away, to find a pharmacy that even had tetracyclines in stock. That was in the mid-80s, 30 years ago. So it's 18% that I feel the conversation should be centered around. Forget that 80%. Forget the fact that some people say all antibiotics are prescribed by doctors of veterinary medicine, which we know is not true. Let's look at the 18%. Very quickly here. At the bottom, I've already told you cephalosporins, critically important in human medicine, represent 0.2%. On that graphic, that page that you couldn't read, you go back and do that link, you'll find, and you do the math, 0.2% of all antibiotics sold are cephalosporins, less than 0.1% are fluoroquinolones. 2 of the top 5 categories of antibiotics used in human medicine are hardly ever used in animal medicine. So now, we've only got 3 categories to even talk about. This is just the NIR, and I see I've got NRI, it should be NIR, it's just talking about that 12%. 813,000 kilograms are sold in 2009. 802,000 of those were drugs that were only approved for use in animals. So almost all that 12%. And this is just to give you the link, a letter from FDA to Congresswoman Slaughter dated April 19th, 2011, which I can get for anybody that wants it. This isn't something I dreamt up. This is what the FDA told Congresswoman Slaughter. I'm not trying to make a doctor out of anybody, but the top 5 categories of classes of antibiotics used in humans are penicillin, cephalosporin, sulfa, quinolones, macrolides. You don't see tetracyclines up there. You certainly don't see ionophores up there. These represent 88% of all antibiotics sold for use in human medicine. So let's take a look at those 5 and see, do we have any overlap? Well, first of all, here's 82% of the total volume sold for use in animals. The yellow bars are the amount sold for use in animals. This little green thing down here is the amount sold for use in humans. Almost zero. Now, 68% of the total volume sold for humans came from penicillin, cephalosporins, fluoroquinolones, and except for penicillin, where you see a little bit of use in animals, you don't see any in these other 2. So there's almost no overlap in those 5 categories. That leaves 2 more. Sulfa, we see quite a bit of use in animals and a fair amount in humans. And then the macrolides, that's the Z-Pak, that's erythromycin, Ilosone, whatever other name you might recognize about. You see there, they are used about equally in animal health and human health. And that's where I think the conversation really needs to go, because these macrolides are the drug of choice for many infections. The tetracyclines used to be the drug of choice because the macrolide you can take once a day and it kills the bacteria rather than just slowing it down. It's easy to take. It's easy to remember. Resistance is not developing in humans because it's so easy to take and it's so effective. So I don't want it to lose its effectiveness. When I come down with an illness, that would be my drug of choice. Because if that bacteria is resistant to the macrolide, the next drug of choice is that damn tetracycline that I have to take 4 times a day on an empty stomach that doesn't work very well. So I wish the FDA would consider doing something about the use of macrolides as a feed additive in animals. Now, they haven't done that because if you go back to that NARMS report, remember, there was not very much resistance to macrolides in Salmonella and Campylobacter, so therefore the FDA has not felt the need to take an action. I happen to disagree with them, and I happen to disagree with the industry on that one, but that's where Raymond comes from. I've talked about tetracycline. I'm not going to bore you with that anymore. I put that in there because I know it's so important to the hog industry, but I've already kind of touched on that slide. It just is not a good drug for use in humans. I want to talk a little bit about staph, because you're reading a lot about MRSA these days, and MRSA being isolated from the nares of pigs and cows. Well, staph was discovered in 1880. Penicillin was discovered in 1928, but it wasn't used. The Army was seeing a lot of men die in World War II from infections related to shrapnel and gunshot. And they had nothing to treat this with except sulfa, and it wasn't very effective. They knew penicillin worked, so they mass-produced penicillin, so when the guys invaded Normandy, they had penicillin tablets in their backpacks. And if they got shot or got shrapnel, they immediately started taking the penicillin. Hadn't been approved by the FDA yet, hadn't gone through the trials, but this was a crisis. Government can do things at times like that. So that's when it was first used, but it was only first used in the common population in 1947 after some more testing had been done to prove that it was safe. So it first came out in 1947. By 1950, 40% of all hospital isolates of Staph aureus were penicillin resistant. It had not been used, had not been approved for use in animal industry at all. This all came from the human side, 40% resistant. By 1960, 80% of Staph aureus isolates in hospitals were resistant to penicillin. We got a problem. We don't have a drug that works against staph. So one of those synthetic antibiotics that I talked about, where it was discovered, called methicillin, introduced in 1959 to treat these penicillin-resistant staph infections. 1960, first case of methicillin-resistant Staph aureus found. Methicillin has never been used in the animal industry. Within 1 year, staph was producing MRSA. Big problem for human medicine. Again, not related at all to animal industry. Now, 33% of us in this room have staph in our nasal cavities. It's there. It doesn't bother us unless we get a cut, break in the skin, pick our nose, rub the cut, whatever. That's when you get a staph infection, when you have a break in the integrity of the skin. 2% of us, maybe 2 or 3 people in this room, actually have MRSA in our nasal cavities. If you work in a hospital setting, 10% of you will have MRSA in your nasal cavities because you've been exposed to it. It's just, that's how it spreads. It doesn't cause you to get sick. But if you go into the hospital and have surgery, and that nurse or that doctor has MRSA in their nasal cavity and doesn't practice proper hygiene, you may get a MRSA infection, which is where most of them occurs in hospital settings or outpatient settings. Not from animals. For 4 decades, from 1960 to 2000, almost every single case was hospital-related. But at the turn of the century, because of insurance companies, we were beginning to treat serious infections with intravenous antibiotics in an outpatient setting. We're doing a lot of outpatient surgery. So we got a lot of people out in the community that might develop MRSA because of an outpatient procedure, but they're at home instead of in the hospital, so now it's being spread in the community. You can now cut your foot and get MRSA. You couldn't do that for the first 4 decades unless you went to the hospital to get the cut treated. But now it's in the community. But not a lot, but some. Now, as we talk about MRSA and we get concerned about livestock-associated MRSA going to make us all sick, get sick and die, the CDC just released a report, November 25, it's right there, that the incidence of MRSA from 2005 to 2011 has declined 54%. We are winning the battle. We are not losing the battle. Tell your friends that are worried about MRSA in your hogs, and they read that study that said if you're spreading manure around, people in that neighborhood are more likely to have MRSA. Tell them we're winning the battle. It's down 50% over 6 years because of what the hospitals and CDC are doing. Okay, so do we have MRSA in animals? Yes, we do. Why not? If you're working in a hog confinement area, closed quarters, and you have MRSA in your nasal cavities, you are breathing it in and out. Why wouldn't those hogs acquire some MRSA in their nasal cavities? And if they've got MRSA in their nasal cavities, you bring in a new employee that's never been exposed to MRSA, and that new employee works in those confinement centers for 6 months, yeah, they might have it in their nasal cavities. I might have it in my nasal cavity. I worked in hospitals for 27 years. If I work in a hog confinement center, I might have MRSA because of that. Not one human infection ever linked to livestock-associated MRSA. Remember that when you're having this discussion. Why wouldn't it go back and forth? What's H1N1? Who does that come from? Did it come from humans and go to the pigs, or did it come from the pigs and go to the humans and back to the pigs? I mean, it's an endless cycle. We get lots of infections from animals. Lyme disease, Rocky Mountain spotted fever, West Nile, monkeypox. Lots of diseases come to us from animals. That doesn't mean the animals are bad. This just happens. Things go back and forth. If the pigs could talk, they'd probably say, you damn humans, you gave us MRSA. Instead of us writing about pigs going to give us MRSA, we gave it to them first. Plain old penicillin, I already mentioned. If you got a child or grandchild with strep throat, the doctor's going to give them a shot of penicillin. Same thing I gave back in 1968 when I was a freshman in medical school. Still works. No resistance. Why not? I don't know. Still works for syphilis. Now, none of us will ever know that, but if you have a neighbor that comes down with syphilis, he is going to get a shot of penicillin because it still works. Don't know why. And he sure as heck didn't get syphilis from the animal ag industry. So, superbugs, I've already talked about the definition. It means a bacteria that's resistant to commonly prescribed drugs to treat an infection caused by that bacteria. Superbugs are like MRSA, extremely drug-resistant tuberculosis, vancomycin-resistant enterococcus, vancomycin-resistant Staph aureus. That's a problem now. We used to use vancomycin for MRSA, and now we're seeing resistance develop to vancomycin. Not because of subtherapeutic doses, not because of the patient quit taking the drug when their sore throat got better. That's a drug that's IV, only prescribed by a healthcare professional for a certain amount of time at a certain dose for a certain indication. All things are proper, we still see vancomycin-resistant Staph aureus. That damn bug just develops resistance so fast we can't stop it. Carbapenem-resistant Enterobacteriaceae, that's the one that I mentioned at the start, has a 50% fatality rate. It's called the killer bug. God have mercy on anybody who gets that one. Carbapenem is used in companion animals. I wish the FDA would stop that. Carbapenem-resistant Enterobacteriaceae is not related to eating contaminated meat or anything like that, but I just don't like a drug that's the last drug of choice being used in animals like cats and dogs for runny noses. It's just not right. But all of these superbugs are not related to the animal ag industry. The United States Infectious Disease Society of America has made that bold statement. These are not related to animal agriculture. However, multi-drug resistant salmonella probably is related to agriculture. We cannot deny that. This is just a description of vancomycin. I already talked about it. This is multi-drug resistant salmonella, which may have connections, and the quote from the IDSA. Okay, I'm about done. As promised, we'll have a little bit of time. I'll speed it up. There, 2 new reports came out on antibiotic resistance in September. Again, you've got the links if you want to read the reports. They're about 100 pages long. So I'll highlight, this is from the United Kingdom. They're developing a strategy for the next 5 years to try to slow down this development of antibiotic resistance, which is a real problem. Regardless of the cause, it's a real problem. But they say in their introductory paragraph, increasing scientific evidence suggests that the clinical issues with antimicrobial resistance that we face in human medicine are primarily the result of antibiotic use in people rather than the use of antibiotics in animals. It doesn't say there's no relationship. It says the biggest relationship is human medicine. It doesn't absolve animal medicine, but it does say that's not the biggest point. The CDC, the same month, came out with their first ever report on antibiotic resistance in September 2013. They say the use of antibiotics is the single most important factor leading to antibiotic resistance around the world. Antibiotics are among the most commonly prescribed drugs used in human medicine. However, up to half of the antibiotic use in humans is unnecessary or inappropriate. Pretty big statement. And I'll confess to being a part of that human medicine specter of when the mom drove 40 miles with a kid with a green snotty nose. I wasn't about to say, why don't you go back home and just give it some more Tylenol? I probably would lose the patient. So I prescribed something that was very low dose economic and I didn't think would cause resistance, but I was probably treating a lot of viral infections rather than spending 15 minutes to explain to a person the difference between a virus and a bacteria. I didn't have time. I was in a small town seeing up to 60 people a day. I did not have time. So I overprescribed. Doctors do that. PAs do that. Nurse practitioners do that. This is a 100-page report. They had 3 pages related to the use of antibiotics in animals, and they said, quite frankly, there's no good reason to use antibiotics as growth promoters. It may lead to further resistance. That was the headline for the next week. That's what you read. That's what you heard on TV in the evening news. The CDC came out with a report and said the use of antibiotics in animals is contributing to antibiotic resistance, and we all may die. They disregarded the other 97 pages. It's a wonderful read, by the way. It's a very good document for a governmental agency. There's the National Institute for Animal Agriculture has been having a series of annual seminars on antibiotic resistance in animals. The first 2 involved pharmaceuticals and the animal ag industry only, and the reports came out and said it's all human medicine. This year I was asked to come on board and help them have a broader spectrum. So we had doctors, we had public health officials, we had the Centers for Science and the Public Interest. We had all different views come together in Kansas City, and there you can see the actual video of all the talks, and you can read the white paper, which is an excellent, very concise summation of what was discussed there. If you want to get further educated on this subject, I would highly recommend. It's a lot shorter read than the CDC's 100-page document, but, get what you want. Okay, debate over the numbers sold or used is just a diversionary tactic. It's not the main issue in the public health debate about antibiotic resistance. Quote from Ron Phillips of the Animal Health Institute. AVMA says the issue shouldn't be about the amount or frequency of antibiotics used, but the real issues are the judicious use of antimicrobials and is there a significant impact on human health? I would say there's an impact. Is it significant? I don't know. But I would say we can't say there's no impact. This comes from that white paper put together by the NIAA at the final sentence, and I believe this is the whole gist. The antibiotic use issue is best approached from a systems-based approach that strives to close gaps of misunderstanding and avoid implementing impetuous remedies, like the Danes did, that prove to be meaningless solutions while oftentimes producing undesirable outcomes. This has to be a very high-level conversation. The current use, this is the take-home. This is the take-home. You're going to hear that you're inappropriately using low-dose and subtherapeutic antibiotics for too short period of time, yada, 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 just to drive up income and make the pigs get bigger. That thing you can say with a straight face is the current uses and doses of all antibiotics used in animals have been approved by the FDA as appropriate for different situations at different times in that animal's life. You're not inventing the wheel here. You're not using tetracycline hoping it will do something. You're using it because it's been approved for specific use by the FDA. If your neighbor has a problem with that, tell them to talk to the FDA. Now, if someone in this room is cheating and breaking the law, well, darn you. I hope you get caught. Because I want everybody to be able to say, these are approved at this dose for this length of time, at this time in the animal's life. Ron DeHaven, who used to run the Animal Plant Health Inspection Service when I was running FSIS, across the hall from me, became good friends. He's now the Executive Vice President of AVMA, and he lets me use this quote. I wish it was my quote. When policy regarding the judicious and safe use of antibiotics in food-producing animals is being debated and formulated, it should be based on biological science, not political science. And I already mentioned this really truly is a global issue with the way people travel nowadays. We can do everything possible in this country to control the use of antibiotics in animals to a level that will not affect my health. But if you can go to India and fill a suitcase full of Z-Pak and bring it back home and sell it on the black market, we got a problem. There are many countries where you can just buy antibiotics over the counter. You don't have to have a doctor's prescription or a nurse's prescription or anything. You just buy them because you got a cold and you think it'll help. You know, until we can clean this up on a worldwide basis, what we do here will only have a limited impact. What we do here will impact trade with Canada and Mexico. That will influence their use of antibiotics. We have to be aware of the global. Last point here, and then I'll shut up. This is from a wet market in Vietnam. This is pork. It's their number one meat. Well, if you don't count seafood, but it's their number one terrestrial meat. The pigs are slaughtered at night, cut up, and brought to the wet market. They don't have any refrigeration in Vietnam anywhere, except in some of the five-star hotels. So when the person that's going to be preparing dinner goes through the wet market, they go down here first and they pat the meat to see which one is warmest, because the one that's warmest is the most recently slaughtered, and therefore the least likely to have had time for bacteria to grow. But when the government of Vietnam goes in these wet markets and samples this pork, 51% of all meat is contaminated with salmonella. How is only 51% when the person is patting each piece of meat? I don't know. But it's a 50-50 chance you got salmonella. So you get the warmest piece of meat because it'll have the least salmonella, least time to grow. But then what does the food preparer do next? Goes down here and starts picking up all these fresh vegetables, see which one are firmest or ripest and so forth. So that infection spreads from the pork on down that food chain. It's a worldwide problem.